Good evening. Tonight we wade into the gritty, the classified, and the not-so-glorious side of American national security. Forget the Hollywood versions of rogue agents and conspiracy theories. This story begins not in the shadows of some foreign adversary's dungeon, but in the pristine laboratories and sterile hospital rooms of America's most trusted institutions, funded, directed, and covered up by your own government. The truth is, if you'd been a college student, a hospital patient, or a soldier in the 1950s, you might have been one of the thousands who unknowingly became test subjects in the most illegal, unethical, and disturbing government program in American history. And the men who did this to you? They wore suits, carried briefcases, and told themselves they were patriots. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Silence your notifications, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's step into tonight's journey together. Before we begin, understand this. The history of MKUltra is the history of betrayal. Betrayal of trust, betrayal of ethics, betrayal of the very citizens the government swore to protect. For nearly 2 decades, the Central Intelligence Agency conducted experiments on unwitting Americans, dosing them with LSD, subjecting them to psychological torture, attempting to fracture their minds and rebuild them as programmable weapons. They did this in the name of national security, in the shadow of the Cold War, and they destroyed countless lives in the process. And when they were finally exposed, they burned 90% of the evidence and walked away. No one went to jail. No one faced real consequences. The perpetrators retired with pensions and honours. The victims were left to piece together shattered minds and broken lives. Tonight, we will trace the arc of this program from its birth in the paranoia of post-war America to its death in the harsh light of congressional investigation. We will meet the men who conceived it, the scientists who executed it, the victims who survived it, and the whistleblowers who exposed it. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented, declassified, proven history. The program was real. The experiments were real. The suffering was real. And the men responsible walked free. Part 1. The Seeds of Madness, Post-War Paranoia and the Nazi Inheritance. Chapter 1. Operation Paperclip, when America imported the Devil's Scientists. The story of MKUltra begins not in 1953 when the program was officially launched, but in 1945 in the smouldering ruins of Nazi Germany. As Allied forces advanced through the collapsing Third Reich, they made discoveries that horrified the world. In concentration camps like Dachau, Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, they found the evidence of atrocities beyond comprehension, medical experiments conducted on prisoners without consent, without anesthesia, without mercy. Dr. Josef Mengele had performed twin studies at Auschwitz, injecting children with diseases, attempting to change eye colour through chemical injections, conducting amputations and organ removals on conscious victims. Dr. Sigmund Rascher at Dachau had placed prisoners in pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions, watching as their lungs ruptured and they screamed in agony before dying. He had immersed naked prisoners in ice water to study hypothermia, timing how long it took for them to lose consciousness and die. Other Nazi doctors had infected prisoners with typhus, malaria and mustard gas to test experimental treatments. They had performed forced sterilizations, conducted bone grafts, and transplanted limbs. The Nuremberg doctors' trial would eventually prosecute 23 of these physicians. 7 would be hanged. But while the world was focused on justice, a different program was underway in secret. Operation Paperclip, approved by President Truman despite his stated opposition to bringing Nazis to America, was a clandestine effort to extract Nazi scientists before the Soviet Union could claim them. The official rationale was simple. The Nazis had developed advanced rocket technology, jet engines, and chemical weapons. If America didn't take these scientists, the Russians would. And in the emerging Cold War, that was unacceptable. What the American public was not told was the full scope of what was being imported. Yes, there were rocket scientists like Wernher von Braun, who would go on to design the Saturn V rocket that put Americans on the moon. But there were also doctors, psychologists and researchers whose credentials were built on experiments conducted on prisoners who had no choice, no voice, and no hope. Men like Dr. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, whose altitude experiments were conducted on Dachau prisoners strapped into pressure chambers, men like Dr. Kurt Blome, who had experimented with plague vaccines on prisoners, men whose files were sanitized, their Nazi past whitewashed or buried, so they could be smuggled into the United States and put to work. The moral calculus was brutally simple. National security trumped everything. If these men had knowledge that could give America an edge over the Soviets, then the details of how that knowledge was obtained were irrelevant, or at least that's what the architects of Paperclip told themselves. This decision, to prioritize intelligence value over ethical considerations, to excuse monstrous crimes in the name of strategic advantage, would set the template for MKUltra. The lesson learned was not that human experimentation was wrong. The lesson learned was that human experimentation could be useful, as long as you controlled the narrative and kept the details classified. Chapter 2. The Korean War. Confessions, when American POWs broke. If Operation Paperclip planted the seeds of MKUltra, the Korean War watered them with pure paranoia. In 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea, the United States entered a new kind of war. It was a proxy conflict, the first major military engagement of the Cold War, and it introduced Americans to a terrifying new phenomenon: brainwashing. The term itself was new, a translation of the Chinese Xi Nao or washbrain, but the concept that a person's beliefs, loyalties and identity could be systematically dismantled and rebuilt through psychological manipulation was ancient. What was new was the scale and the apparent success. When American POWs were repatriated after the war ended in 1953, their behaviour shocked the nation. Some had confessed to war crimes they did not commit, dropping biological weapons on civilians, engaging in genocidal campaigns. Others had denounced capitalism, praised communism, and refused repatriation entirely, choosing to remain in China. 21 American soldiers refused to come home. The American intelligence community was stunned. How had the Chinese and North Koreans achieved this? What techniques had they used? And most urgently, could the same thing be done to American prisoners, American officials, American spies? The fear was existential. If the communists could turn a loyal American soldier into a communist sympathizer simply through psychological techniques, then no American was safe. Not diplomats, not intelligence officers, not even the president himself. The CIA launched an intensive investigation. Debriefings of returned POWs revealed a systematic program of indoctrination. Prisoners were isolated, deprived of sleep, subjected to endless lectures on Marxist-Leninist theory. They were forced into self-criticism sessions where they had to confess their capitalist sins and embrace communist ideology. Those who resisted were punished with solitary confinement, beatings, and starvation. Those who complied were rewarded with better food, cigarettes, and social contact. Over time, through a combination of stress, exhaustion, social pressure, and reward systems, some prisoners began to genuinely believe what they were being forced to say. But there were also darker rumours. Whispers of drugs, of hypnosis, of experimental techniques that went far beyond simple psychological pressure. Some returning POWs reported strange gaps in their memory, periods of time they could not account for. Others described being given injections before interrogation sessions. The CIA was desperate to understand what was happening. Were the communists using pharmacological weapons? Had they discovered a truth serum? A way to literally reprogram a human mind? The answer, the CIA decided, was to conduct its own research. If the enemy had these capabilities, America needed them too. And if the enemy didn't, America needed them anyway, because superiority in intelligence was how wars were won. Thus began the search for the perfect interrogation tool, the chemical key that could unlock the human mind, extract its secrets, and if necessary, reprogram it entirely. Chapter 3. Project Bluebird and Artichoke. The predecessors. MKUltra was not the CIA's first foray into mind control research. It was the third iteration, the most ambitious and most reckless expansion of programs that had begun in the late 1940s. The first was Project Bluebird, launched in 1950. Its goal, as stated in declassified documents, was to develop special methods of interrogation that could extract information from resistant subjects. The methods explored included hypnosis, truth serums, primarily sodium pentothal and sodium amytal, and isolation techniques. Bluebird was a small, tightly controlled program run by the CIA's Office of Security. Early experiments were conducted on agency volunteers, officers who agreed to be hypnotized, drugged, and interrogated to test the effectiveness of various techniques. The results were mixed. Sodium pentothal, often called truth serum in popular culture, lowered inhibitions and made subjects more talkative, but it didn't guarantee truthful responses. Subjects under its influence were just as likely to confabulate, to tell interrogators what they wanted to hear as they were to reveal actual secrets. Hypnosis showed some promise in enhancing memory recall, but it could not force a subject to act against their fundamental moral principles. The early Bluebird research concluded that there was no magic bullet, no single technique that could reliably extract truth or compel obedience. But the program also concluded that combination approaches, using drugs to lower resistance, hypnosis to manipulate memory, and isolation to break down psychological defenses, might be more effective. In 1951, Bluebird was expanded and renamed Project Artichoke. The new program had a broader mandate, not just to extract information, but to explore offensive capabilities. Could a person be hypnotized and programmed to carry out an assassination, then forget they had done it? Could memories be erased? Could new personalities be implanted? Artichoke experiments became more aggressive. The CIA began testing on expendable subjects, foreign prisoners, refugees, suspected double agents. Men who, if something went wrong, would not be missed. The locations expanded too. Early tests had been confined to secure CIA facilities in the United States. But Artichoke operations were conducted in occupied Germany, in Japan, in CIA safe houses scattered across Europe and Asia. The level of risk increased. Subjects were given larger doses of experimental drugs. They were subjected to electroshock therapy to induce amnesia. They were kept in isolation for weeks, bombarded with white noise and flashing lights, deprived of sleep until they became delirious. One documented Artichoke experiment involved a suspected Soviet agent captured in Europe. He was drugged with a cocktail of morphine and barbiturates, then subjected to continuous interrogation for 48 hours. When he stopped responding coherently, he was given amphetamines to keep him awake. The interrogation continued until he suffered a psychotic break, becoming incoherent and hallucinating. The experiment was deemed a failure. The subject had broken, but the information extracted was unreliable. He was released, still mentally shattered, with no memory of what had happened to him. Whether he recovered or spent the rest of his life in an institution, the CIA did not record and did not care. By 1953, Artichoke had produced a wealth of data but no reliable breakthroughs. The techniques were too crude, too unpredictable. What the CIA needed was a more scientific approach, a systematic program of research that could explore every possible avenue. They needed a program with a massive budget, with access to the best scientific minds, and with the freedom to operate without congressional oversight or ethical constraints. They needed MKUltra. Part 2. The birth of MKUltra, when the CIA declared war on the human mind. Chapter 4. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who became a monster. Every great evil requires a willing architect, and MKUltra found its architect in Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Born Joseph Scheider in the Bronx in 1918 to Hungarian Jewish immigrants, Gottlieb was a man of contradictions. He had a club foot, a stutter, and a brilliant mind. He earned a PhD in chemistry from Caltech, one of the world's most prestigious scientific institutions. He was a folk dancer, an organic farmer who raised goats and made his own cheese. He was by all accounts a kind and gentle man in his personal life, a devoted husband, a loving father. But Sidney Gottlieb was also the man who would oversee experiments that involved dosing unwitting Americans with LSD, administering electroshock therapy to erase memories, and attempting to create programmed assassins. He was the man who would approve experiments on prisoners, mental patients, and drug addicts, the most vulnerable members of society. And he would do all of this with the calm professionalism of a scientist running a laboratory experiment, because to him, that's exactly what it was. Gottlieb joined the CIA in 1951, initially working in the Technical Services Division, which was responsible for developing espionage gadgets, invisible inks, concealed cameras, poison delivery systems. His background in chemistry made him invaluable, but his true passion was pharmacology. He was fascinated by the idea that chemicals could alter consciousness, modify behavior, and unlock the secrets of the human mind. When the CIA began searching for someone to head a new, expanded mind control research program, Gottlieb was the obvious choice. In April 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles approved the establishment of MKUltra with Gottlieb as its director. The program's mandate was breathtaking in its ambition to explore every possible method of controlling the human mind. The official memo described the goal as developing techniques for the alteration of human behavior through covert means. This included, but was not limited to, drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, psychological torture, and the creation of programmed operatives who could carry out missions with no memory of their actions. The budget was generous, millions of dollars per year, drawn from CIA discretionary funds that required no congressional approval. The structure was deliberately compartmentalized. MKUltra would consist of 149 separate sub-projects, each focusing on a different aspect of mind control research. Most of the scientists and institutions involved would not know they were working for the CIA. Grants would be funneled through front organizations with innocuous names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. This compartmentalization served two purposes. It provided plausible deniability for the CIA, and it prevented the scientists from understanding the full scope and purpose of their work. Gottlieb approached his new role with the enthusiasm of a true believer. He genuinely thought he was doing patriotic work, protecting America from communist mind control weapons. He wrote in a memo to Dulles, "If the communists have these capabilities, we must have them too. If they don't, we must develop them first, because the side that controls the mind controls the future." It was the logic of the arms race applied to human consciousness, and like the nuclear arms race, it would lead to horrors that its architects could never have imagined, or perhaps in Gottlieb's case, simply chose not to imagine. Chapter 5. LSD. The chemical key that shattered minds. Of all the substances tested under MKUltra, none would become more central to the program than lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. Discovered accidentally in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, while working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, LSD was initially dismissed as an interesting curiosity. Hofmann had been attempting to synthesize a respiratory and circulatory stimulant from ergot fungus when he created LSD-25, the 25th compound in his series. 5 years later, in 1943, Hofmann accidentally absorbed a small amount through his skin. What followed was the first acid trip in human history, a disorienting, overwhelming cascade of visual hallucinations, time distortions, and profound alterations in perception. Hoffmann's experience report described seeing an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. He found the experience both terrifying and fascinating. Sandoz, recognizing potential psychiatric applications, began marketing LSD to researchers under the trade name Delicid in 1947, describing it as a tool for helping therapists understand psychotic states. By the early 1950s, LSD was being used in experimental psychotherapy, particularly for treating alcoholism and helping terminally ill patients cope with death anxiety. The CIA first took notice of LSD in 1951 when they learned that Sandoz was preparing to sell a large quantity to the Soviet Union. Panicked at the possibility that the communists might weaponize the drug, the CIA secretly purchased Sandoz's entire world supply, 10 kilograms of pure LSD, enough for 100 million doses. They stored it in a secure facility and began testing. What the CIA discovered electrified them. LSD was the most powerful psychoactive substance ever created. A single microgram, 1/1,000,000th of a gram, could produce noticeable effects. A dose of 100-200 micrograms could cause complete ego dissolution, making subjects highly suggestible, destroying their sense of identity, and causing them to question the nature of reality itself. The effects lasted 8 to 12 hours, during which time a person could be interrogated, manipulated, or traumatized in ways that might permanently alter their psychology. Gottlieb became obsessed with LSD. He saw it as the holy grail of interrogation drugs. If you could shatter someone's sense of self with LSD, then while they were in that vulnerable, confused state, you could implant false memories, extract true confessions, or program them to carry out tasks they would never normally agree to. At least, that was the theory. Testing would determine if it actually worked. The testing began with CIA volunteers. Officers agreed to take LSD in controlled settings, supervised by agency doctors and psychologists. These experiments were documented, consensual, and relatively safe. They revealed that LSD produced profound experiences, but it did not create the zombie-like compliance the CIA had hoped for. Subjects became unpredictable under its influence. Some became paranoid and aggressive, others withdrew into catatonic states, still others had mystical experiences and emerged claiming to have achieved enlightenment. Gottlieb concluded that the controlled tests were flawed. If subjects knew they were being given LSD, they could mentally prepare, create psychological defenses. What was needed was testing on unwitting subjects, people who had no idea they were being dosed, who would experience the full shock and terror of an unexpected psychedelic experience. This, Gottlieb believed, would reveal LSD's true potential as a weapon. And so began one of the most disturbing chapters in MKUltra's history, the program of dosing unwitting Americans with LSD. Chapter 6. Operation Midnight Climax, the Brothel Experiments. In 1954, Sidney Gottlieb approved a subproject so brazen, so unethical, and so obviously illegal that even within the CIA it was considered extreme. It was called Operation Midnight Climax, and it involved establishing CIA-run brothels in San Francisco and New York City for the purpose of testing LSD on unwitting American citizens. The operation was overseen by George Hunter White, a former Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent who had joined the CIA. White was a hard-drinking, larger-than-life character who enjoyed his work far more than was healthy. He was given an apartment on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco and a generous expense account. His job was to turn the apartment into a CIA safe house disguised as a brothel, where prostitutes on the CIA payroll would lure unsuspecting men, dose their drinks with LSD, and then allow CIA agents to observe through one-way mirrors as the drug took effect. The prostitutes were recruited from the local sex trade. They were paid $100 per session, a fortune in 1950s money, and given immunity from prosecution for their prostitution activities. They were trained in how to slip LSD into drinks without being noticed, and instructed to keep the men in the apartment long enough for the drug to take full effect. Meanwhile, White and other CIA observers would watch from behind the mirror, taking notes on the subject's behavior. They recorded whether the men became more sexually aggressive, more talkative, more compliant. They tested whether men under the influence of LSD would reveal secrets to the prostitutes, whether they could be blackmailed, whether they could be manipulated. The subjects were ordinary men, businessmen on trips to San Francisco, sailors on shore leave, tourists, locals. They thought they were picking up a prostitute for a night of paid sex. Instead, they were becoming unwitting participants in a CIA experiment. They would begin to feel strange. Walls would start breathing, colours would become impossibly vivid, time would stretch and compress. Some panicked and tried to leave, only to be convinced by the prostitute to stay. Others became terrified, convinced they were losing their minds. One subject, according to White's notes, became convinced he was dead and spent hours sitting motionless, staring at his hands, trying to understand what it meant to be a ghost. The operation continued for nearly a decade. Hundreds, possibly thousands of men were dosed without their knowledge or consent, and the research value, minimal. The CIA collected reams of data, but it revealed nothing particularly useful for interrogation purposes. What it did reveal was that LSD was wildly unpredictable when administered to unsuspecting subjects. Some became suggestible, others became paranoid. Some had mystical experiences, others had psychotic breaks. There was no consistency, no reliable pattern. You could dose someone with LSD, but you couldn't control what would happen next. George White seemed to understand that the operation had limited intelligence value. In his notes, he wrote candidly about the real reason the program continued. I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? Operation Midnight Climax was shut down in 1965, not because of ethical concerns, but because the CIA concluded it had extracted all the useful data it could from brothel experiments. The prostitutes were paid off and told to never speak of their work. The men who had been dosed were never informed. Many of them would spend years wondering if they had suffered a mental breakdown, never knowing they had been drugged by their own government. Part 3. The Victims. Lives Destroyed in the Name of National Security. Chapter 7. Frank Olson, the Scientist Who Knew Too Much. On November 28, 1953, at 2:30 a.m., a man plunged from the 13th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York City. He crashed through the glass, fell 170 feet, and died from massive injuries when he struck the pavement below. His name was Frank Olson. He was 43 years old, a biochemist who worked for the U.S. Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. The official ruling was suicide. The truth was far more disturbing. Frank Olson was not just any scientist. He worked in biological warfare research, developing aerosol delivery systems for anthrax and other pathogens. His work was classified, and he had top-secret clearance. In November 1953, he attended a retreat for Army and CIA scientists at a remote cabin in rural Maryland. The retreat was organized by Sidney Gottlieb. On the second evening, during an after-dinner gathering, Gottlieb spiked the bottle of Cointreau being passed around. Frank Olson and 6 other scientists drank from the bottle. 20 minutes later, Gottlieb announced with a smile that they had all been dosed with LSD. For most of the men, it was a disturbing but temporary experience. They had hallucinations, felt disoriented and anxious, but recovered once the drug wore off. Frank Olson did not recover. He became increasingly paranoid and depressed. He told his wife he had made a terrible mistake at work. He insisted he was going to quit his job. His colleagues noticed he was unraveling, talking about ethical concerns, about experiments that had gone too far. The CIA grew concerned. Olson knew too much about biological weapons, about MKUltra experiments, about programs that could never be made public. They arranged for him to see a CIA-affiliated psychiatrist in New York. Olson was accompanied by Robert Lashbrook, a CIA agent assigned to keep him under surveillance. They checked into the Hotel Statler together, sharing a room. In the early hours of November 28th, Lashbrook claimed he woke to the sound of breaking glass and saw Olson's body disappearing through the window. The official story was that Olson, suffering from drug-induced depression, had committed suicide. His family was told he died from a classified work-related accident. They were given a small pension and told not to ask questions. But in 1975, when MKUltra was partially exposed by congressional investigations, the Olson family learned the truth. Frank had been drugged without his knowledge, had descended into mental anguish, and had died under suspicious circumstances while under CIA supervision. Frank's son, Eric Olson, spent the next 4 decades investigating his father's death. He uncovered evidence that contradicted the suicide story. The hotel room window had heavy curtains and a radiator beneath it, difficult to jump through accidentally or in a suicidal impulse. The glass was shattered outward, consistent with a body being pushed or thrown, not jumped. A second autopsy in 1994 revealed injuries to Olson's skull, consistent with a blow to the head before the fall. Eric Olson came to believe his father was murdered, that the CIA, fearing Frank would expose MKUltra or object to unethical biological weapons research, had arranged for him to be killed and made to look like a suicide. The CIA has never admitted this. In 1975, President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House and apologized on behalf of the government for the LSD dosing. They were given a settlement of $750,000. But the apology never mentioned murder. The truth of what happened in that hotel room died with Frank Olson and Robert Lashbrook, and the CIA has kept it classified ever since. Chapter 8. Harold Blower, the Patient Who Died for Science. Not all MKUltra victims were government employees or brothel customers. Some were patients in mental hospitals, people suffering from depression, schizophrenia, or other psychiatric conditions. People who were vulnerable, who trusted their doctors, and who had no idea they were being used as human guinea pigs. Harold Blower was a professional tennis player from New York. In 1952, he was 42 years old, recently divorced, and suffering from depression. He checked himself into the New York State Psychiatric Institute, a respected hospital associated with Columbia University seeking treatment. His doctors prescribed talk therapy and medication. What Blower didn't know was that the hospital had a secret contract with the U.S. Army Chemical Corps to test experimental drugs on patients. The drug being tested was a mescaline derivative, a synthetic psychedelic compound that the army hoped could be used for interrogation or as an incapacitating agent. Blauer was injected with the drug 5 times over the course of a month, each dose larger than the last. He was never told what he was being given. He was told only that it was a new medication that might help with his depression. After the first injection, Blauer became agitated and paranoid. He reported feeling like his mind was being torn apart. The doctors noted this in their records and increased the dose. After the second injection, Blauer experienced hallucinations and a racing heart. After the third, he begged the doctors to stop the experiment, saying the drug made him feel like he was dying. They ignored his plea and administered a 4th dose. On January 8, 1953, Blauer was given the 5th and final injection, a massive dose, nearly double the previous amount. Within minutes, his blood pressure spiked. He began convulsing. His heart rate became erratic. The medical staff attempted to stabilize him, but it was too late. Harold Blauer died 2 hours later from cardiac arrest caused by the experimental drug. The hospital covered it up. They told Blauer's family he had died from a sudden, unpredictable reaction to routine medication. They altered his medical records to hide the experimental injections. The truth only emerged in 1975, when congressional investigations into MKUltra revealed the experiments. Blauer's family sued the government. It took 14 years, but in 1987 they won a settlement of $700,000. The judge in the case wrote a scathing opinion stating that Harold Blauer had been treated as a guinea pig and that his death was the result of callous disregard for human life. Harold Blauer's story is a reminder that MKUltra's victims were not just spies or criminals or expendable subjects. They were ordinary people, patients seeking help, citizens trusting their government, human beings who deserved protection, not exploitation. Chapter 9. Whitey Bulger, the mobster who was broken. One of the most famous MKUltra victims didn't learn he had been experimented on until decades later, when he was already one of America's most notorious criminals. James Whitey Bulger, the Boston mob boss who would later become an FBI informant and fugitive, was an MKUltra subject in the late 1950s. In 1957, Bulger was a 28-year-old criminal serving a sentence at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for armed robbery and truck hijacking. He volunteered for what was described as a medical research program studying a cure for schizophrenia. Prisoners were offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation. What Bulger and the other volunteers didn't know was that the program was actually MKUltra Sub-Project 3, run by Dr. Carl Pfeiffer of Emory University and funded by the CIA. The experiments involved dosing prisoners with LSD and other hallucinogens, then observing their psychological responses. Bulger was given LSD at least 50 times over 15 months. He described the experience in later interviews as horrific. Endless hours of hallucinations, paranoia, and terror strapped to a bed in a locked room with no explanation of what was being done to him. He said he could hear voices, see things that weren't there, and felt his sense of self dissolving. "I was in sheer terror," Bulger told his attorney years later. "I thought I was losing my mind completely. They would give me the drugs, watch me through a window and write notes. I felt like a lab rat." The CIA's goal with the prison experiments was to determine if LSD could be used to break down prisoners' resistance during interrogation. Could you dose a Soviet spy with LSD, then while he was in that vulnerable state, extract intelligence or implant false memories? The prison experiments suggested it was possible, but unreliable. Some subjects became catatonic, others became violently aggressive. Still others, like Bulger, emerged psychologically damaged but resistant to suggestion. Bulger was released from prison in 1965 and went on to become one of Boston's most feared gangsters, eventually serving as an FBI informant while simultaneously running a criminal empire. He has claimed that the LSD experiments at Atlanta contributed to his violent behavior and paranoia in later life. In a 2011 letter he wrote, "I haven't slept all night for years. I keep having nightmares from those experiments. Did they screw me up? Absolutely they did." Whitey Bulger was finally captured in 2011 after 16 years as a fugitive. He was convicted of 11 murders and died in prison in 2018, beaten to death by fellow inmates. Whether MKUltra made him into a monster or simply exploited a monster in the making is impossible to know. But what is certain is that James Bulger, like thousands of others, was used as a human test subject without his informed consent, in experiments that violated every ethical standard of medical research. Part 4. The Techniques. What the CIA Did to Human Minds. Chapter 10. The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. One of MKUltra's most ambitious and disturbing goals was to create what the CIA called the Manchurian Candidate, a programmed assassin who could be activated with a trigger phrase, carry out a mission, and then have no memory of what they had done. The concept came from the 1959 novel by Richard Condon, which depicted a Korean war POW brainwashed to become an unwitting political assassin. The CIA wanted to know, could this actually be done? The theoretical basis was a combination of hypnosis, drugs, and trauma. The idea was to use LSD or another powerful psychedelic to shatter a subject's existing personality, creating what psychologists call a dissociative state. Then, using hypnosis and behavioral conditioning, you would implant new programming, a false identity, a cover story, and a compulsion to carry out a specific action when triggered by a predetermined signal. Finally, you would use electroshock therapy or additional drugs to create amnesia, ensuring the subject had no conscious memory of the programming. Was it possible? The MKUltra researchers spent years trying to find out. They experimented on prisoners, mental patients, and volunteers, attempting to create artificially induced multiple personality disorder. Some experiments involved keeping subjects in isolation for weeks, bombarding them with audio recordings of repeated phrases, trying to break down their sense of self and implant new beliefs. Other experiments used a combination of LSD and hypnosis, attempting to program subjects to carry out simple tasks, picking up a phone, entering a room, while in a trance state. The results were mixed and largely disappointing from the CIA's perspective. They found that hypnosis could create temporary behavioral changes in highly suggestible individuals, but it could not force someone to act against their core moral beliefs. You could hypnotize a person to forget a conversation, to act out a simple scripted behavior, or to experience false memories, but you could not reliably program someone to commit murder unless they were already predisposed to violence. LSD made subjects more malleable and confused, but it also made them unpredictable. A subject dosed with LSD might become suggestible, or they might become paranoid and aggressive, or they might simply curl up in a ball and refuse to respond to commands. There was no way to guarantee a particular response. Electroshock therapy could induce amnesia, but it was crude. It didn't selectively erase specific memories. It often wiped out large chunks of a person's past, leaving them disoriented and unable to function. And the amnesia wasn't always permanent. Memories often returned over time, sometimes triggered by unexpected cues. The closest the CIA came to creating a Manchurian candidate was a series of experiments conducted in Canada by Dr. Ewan Cameron, a psychiatrist at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute. Cameron's work, funded by MKUltra through a front organization, involved a technique he called psychic driving. Patients, most of them suffering from depression, anxiety, or PTSD, were put into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time. While unconscious, they were subjected to electroshock therapy far more intense than standard psychiatric treatment, sometimes 30 times the normal dosage. This was meant to wipe their existing personalities clean, creating what Cameron called a blank slate. Once the patient's memory and personality had been sufficiently destroyed, Cameron would begin the programming phase. He would place headphones on the unconscious patient and play tape-recorded messages on a loop for 16 to 20 hours a day. The messages were simple, positive affirmations. You are a good mother. You are confident. You are happy. The idea was that by hearing these messages hundreds of times while in a vulnerable state, the patient's brain would absorb them, and a new, healthier personality would emerge. The results were catastrophic. Patients emerged from Cameron's treatment with massive gaps in their memory. Some didn't recognize their own children. Others forgot how to use a toilet, how to eat, how to speak. One woman, Linda MacDonald, entered Cameron's clinic in 1963, suffering from postpartum depression. She left unable to remember her wedding, the birth of her children, or even her own name. She had to be taught to read and write again, as if she were a child. She spent the rest of her life trying to rebuild an identity that had been deliberately destroyed. Cameron's experiments proved that you could erase a personality, but you couldn't reliably build a new one. The human mind, it turned out, was not a computer that could be wiped and reprogrammed. It was far more complex, far more resilient, and far more fragile than the CIA's behaviorists had imagined. The search for the Manchurian candidate ended in failure, but the victims of that search carried the scars for life. Chapter 11: Sensory Deprivation and Psychological Torture. Another major thread of MKUltra research focused on sensory deprivation, the systematic removal of all external stimuli to break down a subject's psychological defenses. The theory, developed by psychologist Donald Hebb at McGill University, was that the human brain requires constant sensory input to maintain normal functioning. Remove that input, and the brain begins to malfunction, producing hallucinations, anxiety, and a desperate craving for any kind of stimulation, even pain, even interrogation. Hebb's initial experiments in the 1950s were relatively benign. Student volunteers were paid to lie in a soundproof, light-proof isolation chamber for several hours while wearing goggles, gloves, and earmuffs that minimized sensory input. The results were striking. After just a few hours, subjects began to hallucinate. They saw colors, shapes, and patterns that weren't there. They heard voices and music. Their sense of time became distorted. Hours felt like days. Most subjects couldn't tolerate more than 48 hours of isolation before becoming severely disoriented and begging to be released. The CIA saw immediate applications. If sensory deprivation could make subjects hallucinate and lose their grip on reality in just a few hours, what would happen if you combined it with drugs, stress positions, and interrogation? Could you break a prisoner so thoroughly that they would confess to anything, believe anything, do anything to make it stop? MKUltra researchers began experimenting with more extreme forms of sensory deprivation. Subjects were placed in completely dark, soundproof rooms for days or weeks at a time. They were restrained in straitjackets or confined to spaces so small they couldn't stand or fully lie down. Some experiments involved placing subjects in water tanks designed to eliminate even the sensation of gravity, total sensory isolation. The effects were devastating. Subjects emerged from extended isolation, experiencing symptoms identical to psychosis: hallucinations, paranoia, delusions, inability to distinguish between reality and imagination. Some never fully recovered. Their sense of identity remained fractured, their perception of time permanently distorted. The CIA also explored the opposite extreme: sensory overload. Experiments involved subjecting prisoners to constant noise, white noise, loud music, or recorded sounds played at ear-splitting volume for hours or days. Others involved continuous bright lights, flashing strobe effects, or being forced to stare at complex rotating patterns designed to induce dizziness and disorientation. Combined with sleep deprivation, these techniques proved highly effective at breaking down psychological resistance. A subject kept awake for 72 hours while subjected to constant noise and flashing lights would become so desperate for sleep, for silence, for relief, that they would say or do almost anything. But the intelligence gathered this way was unreliable. Subjects would confess to crimes they hadn't committed, implicate innocent people, or simply tell interrogators whatever they wanted to hear in hopes of ending the torture. These techniques, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, stress positions, loud noise, extreme temperatures, were later codified in the CIA's enhanced interrogation manuals. They were used at black site prisons during the War on Terror, at Abu Ghraib, at Guantanamo Bay. The legal justification was that they didn't constitute torture because they didn't cause permanent physical damage. But the MKUltra researchers knew the truth. These techniques destroyed minds just as effectively as any physical torture. They just left fewer visible scars. Part 5. The Exposure. When the Truth Came Out, Chapter 12. The Church Committee, Congress, finally investigates for 22 years. MKUltra operated in complete secrecy. CIA officers testified before Congress under oath that the agency did not conduct domestic operations, did not experiment on unwitting Americans, and operated within the law. These were lies. But without proof, without documentation, without whistleblowers willing to risk their careers and their lives, the lies held. Then, in December 1974, journalist Seymour Hersh published an explosive article in the New York Times. Based on leaked information from disgruntled CIA officers, Hersh reported that the CIA had conducted massive illegal domestic surveillance operations against anti-war activists and civil rights leaders during the 1960s and 70s. The program, codenamed Chaos, had spied on thousands of American citizens in direct violation of the CIA's charter. The revelation sparked outrage. President Gerald Ford, hoping to contain the damage, established the Rockefeller Commission to investigate CIA abuses. But Congress, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, demanded a more thorough inquiry. In January 1975, the Senate's Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities, better known as the Church Committee, was formed with sweeping investigative powers. As the Church Committee began its work, a CIA officer named John Marks approached committee staffers with explosive information. Marks had left the agency and was writing a book about intelligence operations. During his research, he had stumbled upon references to programs with strange names: Artichoke, Bluebird, MKUltra. He shared what he knew with the committee, and they issued subpoenas demanding that the CIA turn over all relevant documents. This is when Sidney Gottlieb made his fatal mistake. In late 1972, as he prepared for retirement the following year, Gottlieb ordered the destruction of all MKUltra records. In 1973, he officially retired from the CIA, and with him went any chance of full accountability. His justification was routine bureaucratic housekeeping. The program had been shut down in 1964. Officially, though, some sub-projects continued into the 70s, and the files were taking up space, tens of thousands of pages documenting experiments, victims, results, and expenditures were shredded or burned. But Gottlieb's destruction order wasn't comprehensive enough. Financial records had been kept separately. When the Church Committee subpoenaed MKUltra documents, the CIA claimed they had been destroyed. But then investigators found boxes of financial records in an archive building in Virginia, detailed accounting of MKUltra's budget, which sub-projects had received funding, which universities and hospitals had participated, how much money had been spent. From these financial records, the committee was able to piece together the basic structure of MKUltra. They identified 149 sub-projects, 44 universities and hospitals that had participated, most unknowingly, and a budget that exceeded $25 million over 20 years, equivalent to over $200 million today. They found evidence of LSD experiments, sensory deprivation research, hypnosis studies, and collaborations with former Nazi scientists. In August 1975, Senator Church held televised hearings. Sidney Gottlieb was called to testify. Now retired and living on his farm in Virginia, Gottlieb appeared before the committee and delivered a performance that was equal parts evasion and justification. He admitted that MKUltra had existed, that it had tested LSD on unwitting subjects, and that some experiments had been regrettable. But he insisted that everything had been done in the name of national security, that the Cold War required such measures, and that he had no regrets. When asked about Frank Olson's death, Gottlieb expressed sympathy for the family but maintained that it was a tragic suicide resulting from an unfortunate drug reaction, nothing more. When asked about the destruction of records, he claimed it was standard procedure and had nothing to do with covering up crimes. When asked if any laws had been broken, he invoked national security and refused to answer on grounds that the information was still classified. The Church Committee's final report, published in 1976, was damning. It concluded that MKUltra had violated constitutional rights, broken numerous laws, and demonstrated a profound disrespect for human life and human dignity. It recommended new oversight mechanisms for intelligence agencies, including permanent congressional intelligence committees and requirements that covert operations be reported to Congress. But there were no criminal prosecutions, no one went to jail. Sidney Gottlieb was never charged with any crime. He died in 1999 at age 80, maintaining to the end that he had been a patriot doing his duty. The CIA issued a formal apology but took no responsibility for individual harms. The victims were offered small financial settlements in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. Most accepted, desperate for any acknowledgement of what had been done to them. The Church Committee's revelations in 1975-1976 shocked the nation, but the shock was temporary. Within a few years, public attention had moved on. The CIA implemented cosmetic reforms, more paperwork, more reporting requirements, but the fundamental structure of unchecked secret programs remained intact. And as one generation of Cold Warriors retired, a new generation took their place, convinced that this time This crisis, this enemy, was different enough to justify methods their predecessors had been condemned for using. The techniques didn't disappear, they evolved, and sometimes they created monsters in unexpected ways. Chapter 13. The Unabomber Connection, a Legacy of Violence. One of the most disturbing potential legacies of MKUltra involves Ted Kaczynski, the domestic terrorist known as the Unabomber, who killed 3 people and injured 23 others with mail bombs between 1978 and 1995. While no direct proof exists, compelling evidence suggests that Kaczynski may have been an unwitting MKUltra subject during his time at Harvard University, and that the experiments contributed to his transformation from a brilliant mathematician into a violent anti-technology terrorist. In 1958, Theodore Kaczynski entered Harvard at age 16 as part of a program for gifted students. He was younger than his classmates, socially isolated, and intellectually brilliant. Starting in his sophomore year, in 1959, he volunteered for a psychological study run by Dr. Henry Murray, a professor in the Department of Social Relations. The study was described as examining stress responses and personal beliefs. What Kaczynski didn't know was that Murray had conducted research for the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's predecessor, during World War II and had continued working on CIA-funded projects. The experiment Kaczynski participated in was brutal. He was asked to write detailed essays about his personal philosophy and deepest beliefs. Then, he was brought into a room and subjected to what Murray called vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks on everything he had written. A law student, posing as a fellow student, would spend hours tearing apart Kaczynski's ideas, mocking his beliefs, attacking his character, while Kaczynski was strapped to a chair with electrodes measuring his physiological responses. The sessions were filmed without Kaczynski's knowledge. This stress test was repeated weekly for 3 years. The psychological impact on a socially awkward 16-year-old was profound. Kaczynski later described feeling humiliated and violated. He became increasingly withdrawn, paranoid, and hostile toward institutions and technology. After graduating from Harvard, Kaczynski earned a PhD in mathematics from University of Michigan and briefly taught at UC Berkeley. But in 1971, he abruptly quit academia and retreated to a remote cabin in Montana with no electricity or running water. Over the next 25 years, he developed an ideology that blamed technology and industrialization for humanity's problems, and concluded that violent action was necessary to stop technological progress. Could the Harvard experiments have contributed to Kaczynski's radicalization? Psychologist Dr. Gary Greenberg, who studied Kaczynski's case, argues yes. The experiments, Greenberg notes, were designed to attack a person's core identity, to create profound psychological stress by destroying their belief system. For a young, isolated individual like Kaczynski, this could have been deeply traumatic and potentially laid the groundwork for his later paranoia and antisocial behavior. Murray's Harvard experiments were funded by MKUltra. Declassified financial records show payments to Murray's lab during the years Kaczynski participated. Whether the experiments were directly testing mind control techniques or were simply exploring stress responses as Murray claimed, the fact remains. A CIA-funded program subjected an unwitting 16-year-old to years of psychological abuse, and that teenager grew up to become one of America's most notorious terrorists. Kaczynski himself has never explicitly blamed the Harvard experiments for his actions, but in his writings he describes a profound sense of having been violated by society and institutions, of feeling that his autonomy and dignity had been systematically destroyed. Whether MKUltra created the Unabomber or simply damaged an already troubled individual, we will never know for certain, but the connection is too compelling to ignore. Part 6. The Reckoning. What MKUltra taught us about power. Chapter 14. The Philosophical Horror, Why MKUltra Matters. MKUltra's scope was significantly reduced in 1964 as LSD experiments proved unreliable. The program officially continued until 1973 when Sidney Gottlieb retired and ordered the destruction of records, though some sub-projects ran until 1977. The program's stated goals were never achieved. The CIA never found a reliable truth serum, never created a Manchurian candidate, never developed a way to control the human mind. By every measurable metric, MKUltra was a scientific failure. But as a case study in institutional evil, it was profoundly successful at revealing something terrible about human nature and bureaucracy. MKUltra demonstrated that ordinary people, doctors, scientists, psychologists, could commit atrocities if those atrocities were legitimized by institutional authority, classified as necessary for national security, and compartmentalized so that no single person felt fully responsible. Sidney Gottlieb was not a sadist. He didn't torture people because he enjoyed suffering. He did it because he genuinely believed it was necessary to protect America from communist mind control weapons. The doctors who administered LSD to unwitting patients weren't monsters. They were researchers who'd been told by trusted institutions that the experiments were legal, ethical, and vital to national security. The CIA officers who destroyed evidence weren't criminals covering up crimes. They were bureaucrats following orders, protecting classified information, doing what they thought was best for the agency. This is the banality of evil that philosopher Hannah Arendt described in her study of Nazi war crimes. Evil doesn't require monsters, it just requires ordinary people who follow orders, defer to authority, and compartmentalize their moral responsibility. MKUltra also revealed the fundamental incompatibility between secrecy and democracy. In a democratic society, the government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, but consent requires knowledge. The American people cannot consent to programs they don't know exist, and when intelligence agencies operate in total secrecy, claiming that national security requires the public remain ignorant, democracy becomes a fiction. The CIA's response to being exposed was not to accept accountability, but to perfect its secrecy. After the Church Committee investigations, the agency implemented new oversight procedures, required that covert operations be reported to congressional intelligence committees, and promised to operate within the law. But the fundamental structure remained unchanged. The CIA still operates secret programs. It still conducts experiments the public knows nothing about. And when pressed for details, it still invokes national security and classification. We know about MKUltra only because Sidney Gottlieb failed to destroy all the evidence. We know about it because whistleblowers risked their careers to speak truth to power. We know about it because journalists pursued the story, and Congress, for a brief moment in the 1970s, had the courage to investigate its own intelligence agencies. But what don't we know? What programs are running right now, classified and compartmentalized, that our grandchildren will learn about 50 years from now when the documents are finally declassified? What experiments are being conducted on people who will never know, who will never be compensated, who will never receive justice? MKUltra is not ancient history. It is a reminder that governments will do terrible things if given the power and secrecy to do so. It is a reminder that national security can be invoked to justify almost any atrocity. It is a reminder that the only check on institutional power is transparency, accountability, and the willingness of ordinary citizens to demand both. Chapter 15. Modern Echoes. The legacy continues. In the decades since MKUltra was exposed, the tactics developed by the program have not disappeared. They have simply been refined, renamed, and redeployed under new justifications. After the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the CIA established a network of secret prisons, black sites, in countries like Poland, Romania, Thailand, and Afghanistan. At these facilities, suspected terrorists were subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques, a euphemism for torture designed by psychologists who had studied MKUltra's research. The techniques included waterboarding, sleep deprivation for up to 11 days straight, stress positions that caused excruciating pain, forced nudity, sexual humiliation, and sensory overload through constant loud music and flashing lights. These were not invented techniques. They were refined versions of methods developed and tested during MKUltra. The sensory deprivation research from the 1950s became the foundation for isolation cells where prisoners were kept in total darkness for months. The stress position experiments became the basis for walling and cramped confinement in boxes too small to stand or lie down. The psychological torture techniques developed by Ewan Cameron became the template for the systematic destruction of prisoners' mental defences. In 2014, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a heavily redacted report on the CIA's detention and interrogation program. It documented that at least 119 prisoners had been subjected to these techniques, that the program had produced no actionable intelligence that couldn't have been obtained through legal interrogation, and that the CIA had systematically lied to Congress, the White House, and the American people about its effectiveness. The architects of this program, the psychologists who designed it, the CIA officers who implemented it, the lawyers who justified it, faced no criminal prosecution. Like Sidney Gottlieb before them, they claimed they were patriots protecting America. Like MKUltra, the program was defended as necessary in a time of existential threat. And like MKUltra, it demonstrated that the lessons of history are easily forgotten when fear and secrecy combine. The techniques developed under MKUltra have also influenced modern policing. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological manipulation are now standard components of police interrogations in the United States. The Reid technique, taught to law enforcement across the country, uses many of the same principles MKUltra researchers explored: creating stress, offering false promises of leniency, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities to extract confessions. Studies have shown this approach produces false confessions at alarming rates, yet it remains the dominant interrogation method in American law enforcement. Chapter 16. The questions that remain unanswered. Even after congressional investigations, declassified documents, and decades of research, fundamental questions about MKUltra remain unanswered. Sidney Gottlieb's destruction of 90% of the program's records ensured that the full truth would never be known. How many people were experimented on? The Church Committee estimated at least 20,000 unwitting subjects, but this was based on fragmentary financial records and testimony from witnesses with every reason to minimize the scope. The true number could be far higher. Universities, hospitals, and prisons across the country participated in MKUltra sub-projects, often without knowing the CIA was funding them. Graduate students conducted experiments on fellow students. Doctors tested drugs on mental patients. Prison wardens allowed researchers access to inmates. How many of these experiments were MKUltra funded? How many subjects were there? We will never know. How many people died? Frank Olson's death is the most famous, but he was certainly not the only one. Harold Blauer died from a drug overdose during MKUltra testing. CIA documents reference other deaths but provide no details. How many subjects suffered fatal reactions to experimental drugs? How many committed suicide after their minds were shattered by LSD or electroshock? How many died years later from long-term psychological damage? The destroyed records took these answers to the grave. Were any of the Manchurian candidate experiments successful? The official position is that all attempts to create programmed assassins failed. But Gottlieb destroyed the records. The CIA has released only a fraction of surviving documents, and the very nature of such a program would require absolute secrecy. If it had worked, it would be the most closely guarded secret in intelligence history. We have only the CIA's word that it didn't work, and given the agency's long history of lying to Congress, to presidents, and to the American people, that word is worth very little. What other programs like MKUltra are running right now? The CIA did not stop conducting secret experiments because of moral enlightenment. It stopped because it got caught. The agency still operates black sites, still runs covert operations, still claims national security requires secrecy that supersedes democratic accountability. What experiments are being conducted today that our children will learn about in 2075 when the documents are finally declassified? What techniques are being developed? What drugs tested? What psychological boundaries pushed? The most disturbing question is not what happened in the past, but what is happening right now that we don't know about. Chapter 17. The Survivors. Speak of the thousands who were experimented on, only a handful ever learned what had been done to them. Most died never knowing why they had experienced inexplicable mental breakdowns, sudden psychotic episodes, or gaps in memory. But a few survivors have told their stories, and those stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of institutional evil. Linda MacDonald, the woman whose memory was destroyed by Ewan Cameron's psychic driving experiments, spent decades trying to rebuild an identity that had been deliberately erased. She had to relearn her own history from family members, photographs, and documents. She described it as being a ghost in her own life, watching a person she didn't recognize living in her body. She sued the CIA and won a settlement, but no amount of money could restore the 30 years of memory that Cameron had destroyed. She died in 2016, having spent her life trying to become whole again. Velma Orlikow, another of Cameron's victims, became an advocate for MKUltra survivors. She testified before Congress, gave interviews to journalists, and fought for compensation for those who had been experimented on. She described the experiments as psychological rape, a violation so profound that it destroyed not just memories, but identity itself. She won a lawsuit against the CIA and used the settlement money to help other survivors. She died in 1990, still fighting for full disclosure of her MKUltra's records. The men who participated in the prison experiments, prisoners like Whitey Bulger, who volunteered for what they thought was medical research, emerged traumatized and psychologically damaged. Many reported lifelong nightmares, paranoia, and an inability to trust institutions or authority figures. Some became addicted to drugs in an attempt to cope with the psychological wounds. Others withdrew from society entirely, unable to function in a world that had betrayed them so completely. The families of those who died, Frank Olson's son Eric, Harold Blauer's daughter Elizabeth, spent their lives seeking justice, accountability, and truth. They fought the CIA in court, lobbied Congress for investigations, and refused to accept the official narratives. They understood that the fight was not just about their loved ones, but about the principle that governments cannot be allowed to experiment on their own citizens without consequences. These survivors and their families represent the human cost of MKUltra. They are the reason we know about the program at all. Without their courage, their persistence, and their refusal to be silenced, MKUltra would have remained what the CIA intended it to be, a perfectly buried secret. Conclusion: the lesson we refuse to learn. Chapter 18, The Eternal Return, Why MKUltra Keeps Happening. In the immediate aftermath of the Church Committee investigations, there was a brief moment when it seemed America had learned its lesson. New oversight mechanisms were established. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act created a special court to review warrant requests for domestic surveillance. The CIA was required to report covert operations to congressional intelligence committees. The use of human experimentation was supposedly banned by executive order. For a few years, it seemed like the guardrails were working. But then came new crises, new fears, new claims that national security required suspending normal ethical and legal constraints. The war on drugs in the 1980s led to the CIA trafficking cocaine to fund Nicaraguan Contras. The war on terror in the 2000s led to torture, extraordinary rendition, and warrantless surveillance of American citizens. Each time the justification was the same: this threat is different, this enemy is worse. This time the ends really do justify the means. And each time, when the truth eventually emerged, the response was also the same: a brief scandal, some public apologies, maybe a few low-level scapegoats punished, then business as usual. The fundamental structure, secret agencies with massive budgets operating with minimal oversight, remained unchanged. The lesson of MKUltra, it seems, is that there is no lesson. Or rather, the lesson is one that those in power refuse to learn. Unchecked power will always be abused. Secrecy will always enable atrocity, and no threat is ever so great that it justifies abandoning the moral principles that supposedly define a free society. MKUltra happened not because a few bad actors went rogue, but because the entire system was designed to enable it. The CIA's charter gave it a mandate to conduct covert operations without meaningful congressional oversight. The classification system allowed it to hide virtually anything by labeling it a national security secret. The legal doctrine of state secrets privilege allowed the agency to have lawsuits dismissed without even having to defend itself in court. And the culture of deference to intelligence agencies, the assumption that they must know things we don't, that they're protecting us from threats we can't understand, created a permission structure for abuse. MKUltra was not an aberration. It was the logical outcome of a system that combines immense power, total secrecy, and the conviction that the ends justify the means. As long as that system exists, MKUltra will keep happening under different names, justified by different enemies, destroying different victims. The only question is whether we'll find out about it in our lifetimes or our grandchildren's. Chapter 19. What we owe the victims. The United States has never fully reckoned with MKUltra. There has been no Truth and Reconciliation Commission, no comprehensive effort to identify all victims, document all experiments, and provide meaningful compensation. The government's response has been the bare minimum required to contain each scandal as it emerges, apologize, offer small settlements in exchange for non-disclosure agreements, Wait for public attention to move on. This is not justice. It's not even accountability. It's damage control. What would real accountability look like? It would start with transparency. Every surviving MKUltra document should be declassified. Every CIA officer who participated should be identified, their actions documented, their justifications examined. The full scope of the program, every university, every hospital, every prison, every victim should be made public. The American people have a right to know what was done in their name, with their tax dollars, by agencies claiming to protect them. It would require compensation that matches the scale of harm. The survivors and families who have received settlements got hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fraction of what the CIA spent conducting the experiments. Real compensation would be in the tens of millions for each victim, plus lifetime medical and psychological care for those suffering lasting effects. It would demand prosecution, not of low-level technicians or guards, but of the decision-makers. Sidney Gottlieb should have been prosecuted for administering drugs to unwitting subjects, for approving experiments that killed people, for destroying evidence. Alan Dulles should have been prosecuted for authorizing a program that violated fundamental constitutional rights. The doctors who conducted experiments on patients should have lost their medical licenses at minimum, faced criminal charges for assault and murder at best. That none of this happened sends a clear message. If you commit atrocities on behalf of the government and keep them secret long enough, you'll get away with it. Most importantly, real accountability would require structural change. The CIA's charter should be amended to require meaningful congressional oversight of all operations, including covert programs. The classification system should be reformed to prevent agencies from hiding crimes behind the veil of national security. A permanent, independent Inspector General with full access to all CIA facilities and documents should conduct regular audits. And Congress should pass a law stating explicitly that national security can never justify human experimentation without informed consent. None of this will happen, of course. The political will doesn't exist. The CIA has too many defenders in Congress, too much bipartisan support, too much power to resist reform, and so MKUltra will remain what it has always been. A historical curiosity, a conspiracy theory proven true, a cautionary tale that we refuse to actually learn from. Epilogue. The cup we keep drinking from. We return, at the end of this long journey, to a simple truth. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it is almost impossible to rebuild. MKUltra broke the trust between the American government and its citizens in ways that reverberate to this day. When people say they don't trust the government, when they believe in conspiracy theories, when they assume the worst about secret programs, they're not being paranoid, they're being rational. Because the government really did dose unwitting citizens with LSD. It really did try to create programmed assassins. It really did torture people in the name of national security. And when caught, it really did destroy the evidence, lie about what happened, and ensure that no one faced real consequences. The tragedy is that this broken trust makes democratic governance nearly impossible. A democracy requires that citizens trust their government enough to grant it power, while that government earns that trust through transparency and accountability. MKUltra, and the pattern it represents secrecy, abuse, cover-up, minimal consequences, makes that trust impossible to maintain. Every person who watches this video must make a choice. You can believe that MKUltra was an isolated historical aberration, that the reforms of the 1970s worked, that such things couldn't happen now, or you can recognize the pattern. Every few decades, we discover that intelligence agencies have been conducting secret programs that violate the law, violate ethics, and violate human rights. Every time we're told it was necessary, every time we're promised it won't happen again, and every time, years later, we discover it did happen again, under a different name, justified by a different crisis. The cup of institutional power mixed with secrecy is always offered with the same promise: drink, and we will keep you safe. Trust us. Don't ask questions. National security requires your ignorance. MKUltra is what happens when a free people accept that bargain. It is what happens when we allow fear to override our principles, when we grant unchecked power in the name of security, when we look away because knowing the truth is too uncomfortable. The victims of MKUltra, Frank Olson, Harold Blauer, Linda McDonald, Whitey Bulger and the thousands whose names we will never know paid the price for that bargain. They drank from the cup without knowing what it contained. They trusted institutions that betrayed them. They believed in a government that experimented on them like laboratory animals. And when they were used up, when their minds were broken and their lives destroyed, they were discarded and forgotten. We owe them more than memory. We owe them accountability that never came. We owe them a commitment to never allow such things to happen again. And most of all, we owe them the courage to refuse the cup the next time it's offered, because it will be offered again. It's always offered again. Good night. And sleep well if you can, knowing that the history we've traced tonight is not just the story of what was done in the past, but a warning about what could be done tomorrow. The program may have ended, but the mindset that created it, that national security justifies any atrocity, that the ends justify the means, that secrecy is more important than accountability, that mindset lives on until we confront it, until we reject it, until we demand better from our institutions and ourselves. MKUltra will always be with us, not as history, but as prophecy, not as what was, but as what will be again. The choice, as always, is ours. We can drink from the cup and trust that those who offer it have our best interests at heart, or we can ask what's in the cup, who mixed it, and why they're so insistent that we drink without asking questions. MKUltra taught us that those questions can save your life, or at minimum they can save your mind. Until next time, rest easy knowing that understanding the darkness is the first step toward preventing its return.